You remember Claudio Nocelli, the Italian navigator who did the impossible in the summer of 2016. The man who sailed beyond Antarctica's ice walls and returned with a story that shook everything we thought we knew about our world. We told you about his journey, about what he claimed to find beyond those frozen barriers, about the evidence he brought back. But what we did not tell you, what we could not tell you until now, is what happened when he came back. June 27th, 2016. Ushuaia, Argentina, the southernmost city on Earth. Claudio Nocelli's vessel pulled into port after 3 months at sea. He had just completed what many considered an impossible journey, sailing farther south than any civilian navigator had dared to go in decades. He was exhausted, weathered by the extreme conditions of the Southern Ocean, but he was also excited. He had evidence. He had documentation. He had proof of what existed beyond the ice walls that surround Antarctica like a fortress. Within 48 hours, everything changed. On the morning of June 29th, maritime authorities arrived at the dock where Nocelli's vessel was moored. They were not local harbour patrol. They were not the usual customs officials who inspect vessels returning from international waters. These were men in dark suits, carrying official-looking credentials that identified them as representatives of something called the National Maritime Security Bureau. They had paperwork, they had authorization, and they had one very clear purpose. They were there to seize everything. Now, here is what makes this so unusual. Claudio Nocelli had been a professional navigator for over 30 years, 3 decades at sea. He had sailed every major ocean on this planet. His record was impeccable. In all those years, he had never once been cited for a safety violation. He had never had his credentials questioned. He had never faced any sort of maritime legal action. His reputation in the international sailing community was beyond reproach. And yet, within 2 days of returning from Antarctica, authorities claimed his vessel had multiple safety violations. They claimed his permits were irregular. They claimed his navigation logs contained discrepancies that required immediate investigation. The official reason given was that Nocelli had entered restricted Antarctic waters without proper authorization under the Antarctic Treaty System. But here is the thing. Nocelli knew the treaty regulations. He had spent months preparing for this expedition specifically to ensure he stayed within legal boundaries, or at least within the grey areas that would protect him from serious prosecution. Yes, he had pushed limits. Yes, he had sailed into zones that were technically off-limits to civilian explorers, but so had dozens of other private sailors and adventurers over the years. Most of them received warnings, maybe small fines. None of them had their entire operation shut down within 48 hours. The authorities confiscated his vessel. They took his navigation equipment, every GPS unit, every compass, every piece of electronic gear he had used to document his journey. They seized his personal logs, the notebooks where he had recorded his observations day by day. They took his laptop, his backup hard drives, his camera equipment. But most importantly, they took something that Nocelli would later say was the real target all along. They took his photographs, all of them, every single image he had captured beyond the ice walls. The pictures of the open ocean where official maps showed only frozen wasteland, the shots of distant shorelines that appeared on no charts, the documentation of temperature readings that contradicted everything we are told about Antarctic conditions, the evidence of his entire journey, the proof that would have validated everything he claimed to have seen, was gone. The official statement from the maritime authorities was brief and bureaucratic. The vessel was being held pending investigation into safety violations and permit irregularities. The equipment and documentation were being retained as evidence. Nocelli himself was not arrested, but he was strongly advised to remain available for questioning and to refrain from discussing the details of his expedition with media or the public. And this is where the story takes a turn that most people do not know about. Because while the authorities were very thorough in confiscating Nocelli's evidence, while they seized every piece of equipment and every document they could find on his vessel, they made one critical mistake. They assumed that Claudio Nocelli had worked alone. They assumed that all the evidence, all the documentation, all the proof of his journey existed only on his boat and in his personal possession. But that was not true, because there was someone else who had been involved in the planning of this expedition from the very beginning. Someone who had helped prepare the navigation charts. Someone who had been present during the preparations and had access to information that Nocelli kept nowhere near his vessel. His daughter, Sofia Nocelli. Sofia was 27 years old in 2016. She had grown up on boats, learning navigation from her father since she was 12 years old. She had studied marine biology in university. understanding ocean currents and underwater topography better than most professional sailors. And when her father began planning his Antarctic expedition in late 2015, she had been his most trusted confidant and technical advisor. Sophia knew something that her father suspected but could not prove. She knew that if he actually succeeded in sailing beyond the ice walls, if he actually found what historical accounts and suppressed testimonies suggested was there, powerful forces would not want that information made public. So she did something that would prove to be crucial to keeping her father's story alive. She made copies, not just simple backups, but carefully hidden documentation that existed nowhere near her father's vessel or his home. Photographs of his navigation charts, screenshots of his planned coordinates, copies of his preliminary observations and temperature readings from the planning phase. She kept them separate, stored in locations that no one searching Claudio Nocelli's belongings would ever think to look, and she kept them secret. Even after the authorities seized her father's vessel and equipment, even after they confiscated everything he had brought back from Antarctica, Sophia said nothing. She watched as her father's reputation was systematically attacked. She watched as the maritime community turned against him. She watched as 30 years of professional credibility were destroyed in a matter of weeks, and she stayed silent, protecting the evidence that remained. But staying silent came with a cost, because what Sophia witnessed in the weeks and months after her father's return was not just the confiscation of equipment or the questioning of his credentials. What she saw was something far more disturbing. She saw a deliberate, methodical effort to erase not just the evidence of what Claudio Nocelli had found, but the man himself. Hey, this is Mr. H, and if you are starting to realize that this story goes much deeper than a simple case of maritime violations, you are absolutely right. What happened to Claudio Nocelli is part of a pattern that has been repeated again and again, with explorers who venture into places they are not supposed to go and return with evidence of things we are not supposed to know about. If you value the truth, if you want to understand what really happens when someone discovers something that challenges official narratives, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this investigation is just beginning. And what we uncover next will show you exactly how far some organizations will go to keep certain secrets buried. Now, Sophia Nocelli kept her silence for 7 years. 7 years of watching her father's life fall apart while she protected the evidence that could have vindicated him. Why did she wait so long? That is a question we will answer. But first, you need to understand exactly what she witnessed in those crucial weeks after her father returned from Antarctica, and why she became convinced that speaking out too soon would have put not just her father at risk, but her entire family. Sophia Nocelli was not supposed to be home that night, June 30th, 2016. She had planned to stay at her apartment in Buenos Aires, 3 hours north of Ushuaia, but something her father said on the phone earlier that day made her change her plans. His voice had sounded different, not scared exactly, but cautious in a way she had never heard before. He told her the maritime authorities had taken his vessel, that they were investigating permit violations, that everything would probably be fine, but he wanted her to know what was happening. But then he said something else, something that made Sophia immediately book the next bus south. He said, very quietly, almost as if he was worried someone might be listening, "They asked about things I never told anyone, things I never wrote down." So Sophia came home. She arrived at her parents' house in Ushuaia around 11 at night. Her father was sitting at the kitchen table with her mother, and the relief on his face when he saw her was unmistakable. They talked for hours that night. He told her everything about the voyage, things he had not mentioned in their brief phone conversations while he was at sea. He told her about finding the passage through the ice wall, about the warmer waters on the other side, about the distant land masses that appeared on no official maps. And he told her about what happened during his voyage that he had not expected. He had not been alone out there. On 3 separate occasions during the final week of his journey, he had spotted other vessels in the distance, military ships. He was certain of it, though they were too far away for him to identify their flags or markings. Ships that had no reason to be in those remote waters, in areas that were supposedly empty ocean, according to every maritime chart. Ships that seemed to be following him, maintaining a consistent distance, observing but never approaching. It was past 3 in the morning when they finally went to bed. Sophia lay awake in her childhood bedroom, thinking about everything her father had told her, trying to make sense of how quickly the authorities had moved to confiscate his evidence. Something about the timing felt wrong. It was too fast, too efficient, too coordinated, as if someone had been waiting for him to return, ready to move the moment his vessel touched port. At 6:15 in the morning, Sophia woke to the sound of her father's voice downstairs. He sounded calm but firm, the way he used to sound when dealing with difficult harbor officials in foreign ports. She got out of bed and moved quietly to the top of the stairs, where she could hear the conversation in the living room below. There were 3 men in dark suits. She could see them through the gap in the stairway railing. They looked official, carried themselves with the kind of authority that comes from government positions, but something about them felt off. They were not wearing the standard uniforms of maritime authorities or customs officials. Their suits were expensive, too expensive for typical bureaucrats, and they had arrived at 6 in the morning, which was unusual for any kind of official visit unless it was an emergency. Sophia pulled out her phone and started recording audio. She did not know why exactly, just instinct telling her that whatever was about to happen, she needed documentation. The conversation was mostly in Spanish, but occasionally the men switched to English, as if they assumed the Nocellis would not understand or were trying to communicate something to each other without being fully transparent. Sophia's English was fluent, a requirement for her marine biology work. She understood every word. One of the men, the one who seemed to be in charge, spoke with a quiet intensity that was somehow more threatening than if he had been loud. He told Claudio that the investigation into his Antarctic voyage was more serious than initially indicated. He said there were concerns about national security, about international treaty violations, about the potential for Nocelli's activities to cause diplomatic complications with other Antarctic treaty nations. But then the conversation shifted. The man asked about the structures. That is the word he used. Structures. He asked if Nocelli had photographed them, if he had recorded their coordinates, if he had shared information about them with anyone else. Sophia felt her breath catch. Her father had not mentioned anything about structures, not in their conversation the night before, not in any of his phone calls during the voyage. He had talked about open water, about warmer temperatures, about distant landmasses. But structures? That was new information. Or rather, it was information her father had deliberately withheld, even from his own family. Her father's response was careful. He said he did not know what they were talking about. He said he had photographed what any navigator would photograph: the ice formations, the ocean conditions, the wildlife he encountered. Nothing unusual, nothing that would interest national security officials. The lead man smiled. It was not a friendly smile. He said, "Mr. Nocelli, we have been monitoring Antarctic waters for a very long time. We know what is there and what is not supposed to be there. We know when someone gets too close to things they should not see. We confiscated your equipment and documentation as a precaution, but we need to know if you made any additional copies, if you stored any data in locations outside your vessel." Claudio said no. He said everything was on his boat, in his equipment, and the authorities had taken it all. There was nothing else. The man leaned forward slightly. "Your daughter studies marine biology in Buenos Aires, yes? She helped you plan this expedition?" That was the moment Sophia realized she was not just an observer in this situation. She was part of it. They knew about her involvement. They had done their research, and they were sending a very clear message. Her father's voice remained steady. "My daughter provided technical advice on ocean currents and navigation routes. She knows nothing about what I found or did not find. She stayed in Buenos Aires during the entire voyage. She had no access to my documentation." Another one of the men spoke up. This one's voice was harder, more direct. "For her sake, we hope that is true. Buenos Aires is a beautiful city, but it can be dangerous, especially for young women who involve themselves in matters that do not concern them." It was not a subtle threat. It was not meant to be. The lead man stood up. He handed Claudio a card with a phone number. "If you remember anything else, any additional documentation you might have forgotten about, any details about what you saw that you would like to share, you call this number. Cooperation now could make things much easier for you and your family. Resistance would be, let us say, unwise." They left a few minutes later. Sophia waited until she heard the front door close, until she heard the sound of a car engine starting outside, until she was certain they were gone. Then she came downstairs. Her father was sitting on the couch, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. Her mother was crying quietly. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Claudio looked at Sophia and said something she would never forget. "Whatever evidence you have, whatever copies you made, you bury them. You bury them deep, and you do not tell anyone, not even me, where they are. These people, whoever they are not going to stop with confiscating equipment. They want to erase everything, and they have made it very clear what will happen if we do not cooperate." Sophia had kept that promise. She buried the evidence, not literally but digitally and physically, in locations scattered across Argentina that had no connection to her family, and she stayed silent. For 7 years, she stayed silent while her father's life fell apart, while his career was destroyed, while his reputation was systematically demolished by a maritime community that suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. She stayed silent even when her father died in March of 2023, taking most of his secrets to the grave. But before he died, he told her one more thing. He told her that staying silent had been the right choice for survival, but that eventually, the truth had to come out. He told her that someone needed to tell his story, to share what really happened, to reveal the evidence that still existed despite all efforts to erase it. He told her, "When I am gone, when they cannot threaten me anymore, you tell them everything." So that is what Sophia is doing now. She is telling everything. And I want to know something. Where are you listening to this from right now? What city? What country? And what time is it where you are? Are you listening at 3 in the morning because you cannot sleep, falling down this rabbit hole of Antarctic mysteries? Or is it your lunch break and you are trying to process what you are hearing about government suppression and silenced explorers? Drop a comment and let me know. Because this story connects people across the entire world, people who are asking the same questions about what we are not being told. And I guarantee you, no matter where you are or what time it is, there are others listening right now who are just as stunned by what Claudio Nocelli is about to reveal. Because the evidence she kept hidden for 7 years is about to change how you think about Antarctica forever. The evidence Claudio Nocelli has kept hidden for 7 years is not what most people would expect. It is not dramatic footage of alien structures or clear photographs of lost civilizations. What Sophia has is something far more mundane and yet far more damning. She has data, raw, technical, verifiable data that proves her father sailed into regions that, according to every official map and every accepted model of Antarctic geography, should not exist. Let me show you what I mean. In late 2015, when Claudio Nocelli was planning his expedition, he worked with Sophia to map out potential routes through the Antarctic ice. They used standard maritime charts, satellite imagery that was publicly available, and historical accounts from other explorers who had attempted to penetrate the ice walls. They identified 3 possible passages, narrow channels that appeared in older maps but were listed as impassable on modern charts. Claudio's plan was to attempt each one until he found a way through. Sophia photographed every one of these planning documents. She has the original charts with her father's handwritten notes, showing the coordinates he intended to reach, the temperatures he expected to encounter, the ice conditions he was preparing for. These documents establish a baseline. They show what Claudio thought he would find based on accepted scientific understanding of Antarctica. Now compare that to what he actually recorded. The GPS unit on Claudio's vessel logged coordinates automatically every 15 minutes throughout his voyage. While the authorities confiscated the primary GPS equipment, Sophia has something they did not know existed. Before her father left on his expedition, she had installed a backup tracking system, a small commercial GPS logger that uploaded data to a cloud server every 6 hours via satellite link. It was meant as a safety measure, a way for the family to monitor his location in case of emergency. The authorities never knew about it because it was registered under Sophia's name and linked to her personal account, not her father's vessel documentation. That GPS data still exists, and it tells a story that contradicts everything we are told about Antarctica's geography. On February 9th, 2016, Claudio's vessel reached the ice walls at approximately 78 degrees south latitude. This matches perfectly with known Antarctic geography. The GPS coordinates place him exactly where the ice shelf should be, according to official maps. For the next 3 days, the tracking data shows him moving east along the ice wall, searching for a passage, maintaining a consistent distance from the barrier. Again, this is all consistent with expected conditions. But on February 13th, something changes. The GPS coordinates show his vessel moving south, past 79 degrees, then 80 degrees, then continuing south into regions that on every official map are marked as solid ice shelf. By February 15th, the coordinates place him at 84 degrees south latitude, roughly 420 miles beyond where the ice wall should have created an impassable barrier. Now, skeptics would immediately say this must be a GPS malfunction. Equipment fails in extreme cold. Magnetic anomalies near the poles can cause navigation errors. These are valid concerns. But here is what makes this data so difficult to dismiss. The GPS logger was a modern unit, rated for extreme cold conditions, and it continued to function normally for the entire voyage, uploading data consistently every 6 hours without any gaps or errors. If it was malfunctioning, you would expect to see erratic readings, impossible jumps in position, or complete data loss. Instead, what you see is smooth, consistent movement tracking that shows a vessel sailing steadily south into waters that should not exist. But the GPS data is only part of the story. Sophia also has her father's temperature logs. Claudio was obsessive about recording environmental conditions. Every 6 hours, he logged air temperature, water temperature, barometric pressure, and wind speed. These logs were handwritten in notebooks that the authorities confiscated, but Sophia has something else. She has the preliminary data he sent her via satellite email during the voyage, brief updates he transmitted when he had satellite connectivity, including temperature readings from his first week beyond the ice wall. These readings are extraordinary. On February 14th, the day after he passed through the ice wall, Claudio recorded water temperatures of 39 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 7 degrees above freezing, in a region that, according to official climate data, should be experiencing water temperatures around 14 degrees Fahrenheit. By February 16th, his readings showed water temperatures reaching 46 degrees and air temperatures climbing to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, those are temperatures you might find in the North Atlantic in winter. These are not Antarctic conditions. These are temperate ocean conditions occurring in a location that should be locked in permanent ice. But it gets stranger. Sophia has photographs, not the hundreds of images that the authorities confiscated from her father's camera equipment, but a handful of photos that Claudio sent her during the voyage via satellite connection. Low-resolution images, compressed to reduce file size for transmission, but sufficient to show what he was seeing. There are 11 photos in total. 3 of them show open ocean with no ice visible to the horizon, clear water under overcast skies. These photos have embedded EXIF data that includes GPS coordinates, placing them at 83 degrees south latitude. For reference, that is farther south than the South Pole itself, and yet the images show liquid ocean, not ice. 4 of the photos show distant landmasses, dark shapes on the horizon that could be mountains or coastal cliffs. The resolution is too low to show detail, but the shapes are there, unmistakable against the grey sky. These landmasses do not appear on any modern map of Antarctica. The coordinates in the EXIF data place these photos at locations that official maps designate as interior ice sheet, hundreds of miles from any known coastline. The remaining 4 photos show something that Claudio never mentioned to anyone, not even to Sophia, until that last conversation before he died. They show atmospheric phenomena that he could not explain. Bands of light in the sky, similar to aurora borealis, but occurring in the middle of the day, and in colors that do not match typical auroral displays. Greenish-blue bands mixed with deep purple, stretching across the sky in geometric patterns that looked almost structured, almost artificial. Sophia had these photos analyzed by 3 separate digital forensics experts, people who specialize in detecting photo manipulation, who work for law enforcement and media organizations, verifying the authenticity of digital images. All 3 came to the same conclusion. The photos show no evidence of digital alteration. The EXIF data is intact and consistent with the camera model her father used. The compression artifacts are normal for images transmitted via satellite connection. The timestamps match the GPS data from the backup logger. Everything about these images indicates they are authentic photographs taken at the locations and times the metadata claims. But here is what really matters. It is not just that these photos exist, it is that they corroborate historical accounts that have been dismissed for decades. When Admiral Richard Byrd returned from his 1947 Antarctic expedition, he gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper where he mentioned flying over areas of ice-free land, regions with temperatures warm enough to support vegetation. His account was dismissed as exaggeration or misinterpretation. His diary, which was classified for decades and only partially declassified in 2015, describes similar conditions to what Claudio Nocelli documented: warmer temperatures, open water, atmospheric anomalies. In 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, a Russian expedition reported finding areas of unexpectedly warm water in regions that should have been frozen solid. Their findings were published in a Soviet scientific journal but largely ignored by Western researchers. The data was attributed to localized geothermal activity, a plausible but convenient explanation that avoided deeper questions. In 1998, a British research team using ice-penetrating radar detected what they described as liquid water lakes beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. These subglacial lakes, including the famous Lake Vostok, are now accepted scientific fact, but what is less commonly discussed is that some of these lakes show thermal activity inconsistent with simple geothermal heating. Temperature readings suggest heat sources that do not match any known geological process. Claudio Nocelli's data fits into this pattern of anomalous findings that have been documented by legitimate researchers and explorers for over 70 years. The difference is that Claudio ventured farther than most, stayed longer, and documented more extensively. And unlike earlier explorers who could be dismissed because their evidence was confiscated or classified, Sophia has kept her father's data safe. She has the GPS logs, the temperature readings, the photographs, and the metadata to prove their authenticity. But the question remains, if these regions of warmer water and ice-free land exist, if multiple explorers and research teams have documented evidence of them over decades, why are they not shown on official maps? Why do satellite imaging systems either blur these areas or show them as solid ice? Why has every attempt to explore these regions independently resulted in confiscation of evidence and destruction of careers? That is the question Sophia Nocelli has spent 7 years thinking about, and she has come to a conclusion that is difficult to accept but increasingly hard to ignore. The suppression is not accidental. It is not bureaucratic incompetence or excessive environmental caution. It is systematic, coordinated, and deliberate. Someone, or more likely some group of people with significant resources and authority, does not want the public to know what exists beyond Antarctica's ice walls, and they are willing to go to extraordinary lengths to maintain that secrecy. The evidence Sophia has is just the beginning. It proves her father sailed where he said he sailed and found what he said he found. But it does not answer the bigger questions. What exactly exists in those ice-free regions? Why is it being hidden? And what happened to Claudio Nocelli in the months after he returned that went beyond simple equipment confiscation? Because the seizure of his vessel was just the opening move. What came next was a systematic dismantling of everything Claudio had spent 30 years building. The professional destruction of Claudio Nocelli began quietly, so quietly that for the first few weeks, he did not realize it was happening. It started with a phone call in mid-July of 2016, about 3 weeks after the maritime authorities had confiscated his vessel and equipment. The call came from Austral Maritime Services, a shipping company based in Buenos Aires that Claudio had worked with for over 15 years. They needed to talk about his contract. Claudio had been contracted to navigate cargo vessels through the treacherous waters around Tierra del Fuego and the Drake Passage. It was specialized work that required deep knowledge of Southern Ocean conditions, work that he had done successfully for years. The company had always been satisfied with his performance. There had never been complaints, never any issues. His contracts were typically renewed annually without question. The conversation was brief and awkward. The company representative explained that due to recent developments, they would not be renewing his contract when it expired in September. When Claudio asked what developments, the representative became vague. Something about insurance concerns, something about liability issues related to his recent Antarctic voyage. The representative could not or would not provide specifics. The decision had been made at a higher level. It was final. 2 days later, another call. This time from Patagonian Shipping Group, another company Claudio had worked with regularly. Same conversation, same vague explanations about insurance and liability. Contract termination, effective immediately. Within a month, 4 more companies contacted him, all with similar messages. Contracts cancelled, future work unavailable. Apologies, but the decision was firm. Sophia watched this happening in real time. She would call her father to check in and hear the strain in his voice as he described another company cutting ties. At first, he tried to maintain optimism. He had contacts throughout South America. He would find other work. 30 years of experience and an impeccable safety record had to count for something. But then the rumors started. Quietly, through the maritime community grapevine, word spread that Claudio Nocelli was unreliable, that he took unnecessary risks, that there were questions about his judgment and decision-making. None of these rumors were substantiated. None came with specific incidents or evidence. They were just whispers, passed from one company to another, from one port authority to another, slowly poisoning his reputation. In September, Claudio applied for work with 3 companies he had never worked with before, companies based in Chile and Uruguay, where his reputation should have been untarnished. All 3 rejected his applications. One of them was kind enough to be honest. The hiring manager told him off the record that there were flags in his maritime record. Not official violations exactly, but notes indicating he was considered a security risk. Potential liability. The kind of designation that makes companies nervous, without giving them concrete reasons why. Claudio tried to find out where these flags had come from. He contacted the International Maritime Organization, the regulatory body that oversees maritime safety standards. They had no record of any violations or concerns related to his certifications. He contacted the Argentine Maritime Authority. Same response. No official record of problems. But when he applied for work, companies kept telling him there were concerns. Information was circulating through unofficial channels, warnings being passed between maritime security offices, creating a web of suspicion that had no official source but somehow reached everyone who mattered. By October, Claudio had not worked in 4 months. The family's savings were running low. His wife had taken extra hours at her job. Sofia was sending money from Buenos Aires to help with expenses. The financial pressure was mounting, but that was not the worst part. The worst part was watching a man who had spent his entire adult life at sea, who had navigated some of the most dangerous waters on Earth with confidence and skill, reduced to calling former colleagues and begging for work, only to be turned down with apologetic excuses that barely masked their discomfort. In November, the situation escalated. Claudio received notification that his Master Mariner certification was under review. The Maritime Certification Board claimed there were irregularities in his recent logbooks that required investigation. This was extraordinary. Master Mariner certifications are not casually questioned. These are professional credentials that take years to earn and are only challenged when there is clear evidence of serious misconduct. The review process dragged on for months. Claudio was required to submit to multiple interviews, to provide documentation of his recent voyages, to answer increasingly detailed questions about his Antarctic expedition. The investigators were polite but thorough. They wanted to know exactly where he had sailed, what coordinates he had reached, what he had seen. They asked about his equipment, his navigation methods, his decision-making process. It felt less like a certification review and more like an interrogation. The certification board never found any actual violations. They could not, because Claudio's navigational work was technically flawless, but the review itself served a purpose. It kept him in a state of professional limbo, unable to work even if he could find a company willing to hire him, because no one contracts a navigator whose credentials are under investigation. The review finally concluded in March of 2017 with a formal reprimand, not for safety violations, not for incompetence, but for what they called unauthorized exploration of restricted maritime zones in violation of international treaty protocols. It was bureaucratic language that essentially meant he had sailed where he was not supposed to sail. The reprimand was placed in his permanent record. It would follow him for the rest of his career, a scarlet letter that told every potential employer that this man could not be trusted to follow rules. But the financial and professional destruction was only one aspect of what Claudio faced. There were other pressures, subtler but equally effective. In January of 2017, the Nocelli family home was visited by tax investigators. They claimed there were irregularities in Claudio's tax filings from the previous 3 years that required audit. The audit was invasive and time-consuming. Every receipt, every bank statement, every financial record had to be produced and explained. The investigators spent hours in the Nocelli home, going through files, asking questions, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and stress. The audit found nothing. No tax fraud, no unreported income, no violations. But that was not the point. The point was the disruption, the implied threat, the message that Claudio's life could be made very difficult if he continued to be a problem. The tax audit visit was repeated in April, and again in August, each time with the same result. No violations found, but hours of invasive questioning and document review. After the third visit, Claudio stopped trying to convince himself these were routine procedures. He knew what was happening. He was being harassed in ways that were technically legal, but clearly coordinated. His bank accounts were frozen temporarily in May, supposedly as part of an investigation into suspicious transaction patterns. The freeze lasted only 3 days, but it prevented him from paying bills, from accessing his own money, from conducting basic financial transactions. When the freeze was lifted, no explanation was provided. No suspicious activity was found. It was just another disruption. Another reminder that his financial security existed only at the pleasure of organizations that could take it away whenever they wanted. Sophia experienced her own version of this pressure. In September of 2017, she was informed that her research funding from the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research was being discontinued. The official reason was budget cuts and reallocation of resources. But Sophia knew other researchers whose projects were far less established than hers who retained their funding. She applied for alternative grants and was rejected by organizations that had previously supported her work. The message was clear. Her association with her father's controversial expedition had made her toxic in academic circles. She found work eventually, taking a position with a private marine biology consulting firm that did not rely on government funding. But the damage to her academic career was real. Research she had spent years developing was abandoned. Professional relationships became strained as colleagues distanced themselves from anyone connected to the Nocelli name. By the end of 2017, Claudio Nocelli's life had been systematically dismantled. He could not work in his profession. His certifications were tarnished. His reputation was destroyed. His family faced ongoing financial and legal pressure. And perhaps most effectively, he had been isolated from the maritime community that had been his professional home for 3 decades. Former colleagues stopped returning his calls. Old friends avoided him at social gatherings. He became a pariah, someone whose presence made people uncomfortable, someone it was safer to stay away from. None of this was officially connected to his Antarctic voyage. There was no single decision, no formal punishment, no public accusation. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each one small enough to be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck, but collectively forming a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Claudio understood what was happening. He was being made an example. The message to other potential explorers was clear. Step out of line. Sail where you are not supposed to. Bring back evidence of things you should not see. And this is what happens to you. Your life does not end dramatically. It just slowly falls apart until there is nothing left. Sophia asked her father once why he did not fight back, why he did not go public with his story, why he did not try to share the evidence he still had hidden. His answer was simple and crushing. Because they made it very clear what would happen if I did. And I will not risk you. October 17th, 2016. 4 months after Claudio Nocelli returned from Antarctica, the systematic dismantling of his career was well underway, but he had not yet fully grasped the scope of what he was facing. He still believed, on some level, that if he cooperated, if he stayed quiet, if he let the authorities take their equipment and their evidence and move on, eventually his life would return to normal. Eventually, the pressure would ease. That belief ended at 2:13 in the morning. Sophia was not staying at her parents' house that night. She had returned to Buenos Aires weeks earlier to resume her research work, but her mother, Elena Nocelli, was a light sleeper, and the sound of a car pulling up outside the house at that hour woke her immediately. She looked out the bedroom window and saw an unmarked black sedan parked on the street. No police lights, no official markings, just a car sitting there with its engine running and its headlights off. Elena woke Claudio. He got out of bed and looked out the window. As he watched, 3 men emerged from the vehicle. They were dressed in dark clothing, not quite suits but professional attire. They moved with purpose, walking directly to the front door. There was no hesitation, no checking of addresses, no uncertainty. They knew exactly where they were going. The doorbell did not ring. Instead, there was a firm knock. 3 measured strikes that somehow conveyed authority without aggression. Claudio considered not answering. It was past 2 in the morning. No legitimate official business happens at this hour, but something about the way those men stood at his door, patient but immovable, told him that ignoring them was not an option. He went downstairs and opened the door with the chain lock still engaged. The man closest to the door was in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that would be immediately forgettable in a crowd. He did not smile. He simply held up an identification card too quickly for Claudio to read the details, then spoke in perfect Spanish, with a slight accent that might have been North American or might have been European. "Mr. Nocelli, we need to speak with you. May we come in?" It was phrased as a question but delivered as a statement. Claudio asked who they were. The man repeated that they needed to speak with him, that it concerned his recent voyage, that it would be better to have this conversation inside rather than on the doorstep. There was no threat in his tone, but there was an absolute certainty that this conversation was going to happen one way or another. Claudio unlatched the chain and let them in. They moved into the living room with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves in a way that was not quite threatening but ensured that Claudio could not easily leave the room. One man stood near the doorway. Another positioned himself by the window. The leader, the one who had spoken at the door, sat down on the couch and gestured for Claudio to sit across from him. Elena had come down the stairs, standing in the hallway where she could see into the living room, but remaining out of direct sight. She had her phone in her hand, ready to call for help if necessary, though she had no idea who she would call or whether it would make any difference. The conversation began calmly. The leader asked Claudio how he was adjusting to retirement from maritime work. He used the word retirement as if Claudio had chosen to stop working, as if the systematic destruction of his career had been a personal decision. Claudio did not correct him. He simply said he was managing. The man nodded sympathetically. Then he said something that made Claudio's blood run cold. "We understand you have a daughter, Sophia. She studies marine biology in Buenos Aires. Impressive young woman. We have been following her research with interest." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with casual precision. They knew where Sophia was. They knew what she did. And they wanted Claudio to know that they knew. The conversation shifted. The man leaned forward slightly and his voice remained calm, but took on an edge of intensity. "Mr. Nocelli, we are going to be very direct with you, because we believe you are an intelligent man who understands how serious this situation is. Your voyage to Antarctica took you into areas that are protected under international agreements for very specific reasons. You saw things during that voyage. We need to know exactly what you saw, what you documented, and whether you have shared that information with anyone." Claudio repeated what he had told the maritime authorities months earlier. He had sailed into Antarctic waters. He had taken photographs of ice formations and ocean conditions. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would interest intelligence services or national security officials. Everything had been confiscated already. There was nothing else. The man smiled, but it was not a warm expression. "Mr. Nocelli, please do not insult our intelligence. We have resources you cannot imagine. We know you reached coordinates that place you far beyond the accepted ice shelf boundaries. We know your vessel recorded temperature readings inconsistent with official climate data for those regions. We know you transmitted several photographs to your daughter via satellite during your voyage. Those photographs were low resolution and difficult to analyze, but they showed enough to concern us." Claudio felt his stomach drop. They knew about the satellite transmissions. They knew about the photos sent to Sophia. That meant they had been monitoring his communications even while he was at sea. They had access to data that should have been private, encrypted, secure. The man continued. "What we need to understand is whether you saw the structures. The formations on the coastline approximately 300 kilometers beyond the Amory ice shelf. Did you photograph them? Did you record their coordinates with precision? And most importantly, do you have any documentation of those structures that was not on your vessel when we confiscated your equipment?" This was the crucial moment. The man was asking about something Claudio had not mentioned to anyone, not to the maritime authorities, not to his wife, not even to Sophia, at least not in detail. He had seen geometric formations on a distant coastline during his voyage, shapes that looked too regular to be natural, but he had been too far away to photograph them clearly. He had made notes in his personal journal about their location, but those notes had been on his vessel, confiscated along with everything else, or so he thought. The fact that these men were asking suggested they had found those notes, which meant they had gone through his documentation in detail, which meant they knew he had seen something significant. Claudio made a decision in that moment. He decided to give them what they wanted to hear, to tell them there was nothing else, no other documentation, no copies, no backup evidence. He told them everything was on the vessel, that the authorities had taken it all, that there was nothing hidden. The man studied him for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street beyond. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost conversational. "Mr. Nocelli, we are not here to threaten you. We are here to help you understand the situation clearly. What exists beyond the ice barriers, what you glimpsed during your voyage, is protected for reasons that go far beyond environmental concerns or territorial disputes. There are international agreements, arrangements between governments that have existed for decades, ensuring that certain discoveries remain classified." He turned back to face Claudio. "Your cooperation is not optional. You will not speak about what you saw. You will not attempt to share any remaining documentation. You will not communicate with other explorers or researchers about Antarctic anomalies. In return, your life will become easier. The pressure on your career will ease. The financial investigations will stop. Your daughter's academic prospects will improve. This is not a negotiation. This is us explaining how things work." The other man, the one who had been standing by the doorway, spoke for the first time. His voice was harder, more direct. Buenos Aires is a beautiful city, Mr. Nocelli. 3 million people. Easy to disappear in a city that size. Easy for accidents to happen. Your daughter walks home from the university laboratory late at night sometimes. That is not safe. You should tell her to be more careful. It was the most explicit threat of the entire encounter. And it worked. Claudio felt any remaining resistance drain away. These were not bureaucrats following protocols. These were people with resources, with reach, with the willingness to harm his family if he did not comply. The leader walked to the door. Before leaving, he placed a business card on the table. Just a phone number, no name, no organization. If you remember anything else, anything at all that you have not told us, you call this number immediately. Cooperation protects your family. Silence protects your family. Nothing else will. They left as quietly as they had arrived. The black sedan pulled away into the night, leaving no evidence it had ever been there except for a business card with a phone number and the crushing weight of fear that now dominated the Nocelli household. Elena came down the stairs after they left. She and Claudio sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she asked what they should do. Claudio's answer was immediate. We do exactly what they said. We stay quiet. We cooperate. And we make sure Sophia knows never to speak about any of this. That night changed everything. It was the moment Claudio Nocelli truly understood he was not fighting maritime bureaucracy or government regulations. He was up against something far larger, far more powerful, and far more ruthless than he had imagined. The morning after the night visitors came, Claudio Nocelli called his daughter. He did not tell her what had happened. He did not mention the 3 men or their threats. Instead, he asked her a simple question that she immediately understood carried weight far beyond its surface meaning. He asked if she still had the old navigation charts from his training days, the ones he had given her years ago when she was learning maritime plotting techniques. Sophia said yes, she still had them. Claudio told her to keep them safe. Then he said something that seemed unrelated but made perfect sense to Sophia given everything that had been happening. He said, "Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that look ordinary, the ones nobody thinks to search for because they assume if something was important, it would be obviously protected." That conversation, brief and seemingly innocuous, was Claudio's way of telling Sophia that, whatever evidence she had hidden, wherever she had stored it, she should make absolutely certain it remained concealed. And more than that, she should make it look so ordinary, so unremarkable, that even if someone searched her apartment or her office or her storage spaces, they would see nothing worth examining. Sophia understood. She had already taken precautions, but now she took more. The 11 photographs her father had transmitted during his voyage were stored on a USB drive. That drive was inside a box labeled Marine Biology Field Data 2012 through 2014. It sat on a shelf in her apartment along with dozens of other boxes containing actual field data from her research projects. Boring, technical, years old. The kind of thing nobody would look at unless they were specifically searching for marine biology research, and even then, they would need to go through hundreds of hours of temperature readings and species population counts before finding anything unusual. The GPS data from the backup tracking system was stored on a cloud server, but not under any account associated with her name or her father's name. It was registered to a research project that had been discontinued 3 years earlier, filed under administrative records that were technically public, but buried so deep in university digital archives that accessing them required knowing exactly what to search for and where to look. The handwritten coordinate notes that Claudio had sent her during the planning phase, the ones showing his intended route and the anomalies he expected to investigate, were photographed and stored as image files labeled with random alphanumeric strings. They sat in a folder on her computer, mixed with thousands of other research images, microscope slides, underwater photography, specimen documentation. One would need to open each file individually to know what it contained, and even then, the navigation charts would mean nothing to someone who was not trained in maritime plotting. But Sophia did not stop there. She created decoy evidence, fake documents that looked important but contained nothing of real value. She created a USB drive labeled Antarctica Project Evidence and filled it with publicly available satellite images of Antarctic coastlines, articles about climate change, and generic photos of ice formations that could have come from any polar expedition. She left this drive in a drawer in her apartment where it would be easily found if someone searched her place. Let them find that and think they had discovered what she was hiding. She did the same with her email. She created draft emails to her father discussing his voyage, but filled them with vague references and nothing specific. Phrases like, Glad you saw some interesting formations, and hope you got good photos of the ice conditions. Messages that suggested she knew about his journey, but contained no actual evidence or coordinates or details that would be useful to anyone trying to reconstruct what he had found. The real evidence, the material that actually mattered, she fragmented. No single location contained everything. The photographs were in one place, the GPS data in another, the temperature logs in a third location. Even if someone found one cache, they would not have enough to piece together the full picture of what Claudio had documented. For 7 years, this system worked. Nobody came looking. Nobody searched her apartment or her office or her university accounts. Either the men who had visited her father believed he was telling the truth when he said there was no additional documentation, or they had decided that as long as the Nocelli family stayed silent, there was no need to pursue every possible lead. But Sophia knew the evidence she had was incomplete. The photographs were low resolution. The GPS data proved her father had sailed to those coordinates, but it did not show what he had seen when he got there. The temperature readings were compelling but could potentially be explained by localized geothermal activity. What she had was enough to corroborate her father's claims, enough to prove he had not fabricated his journey, but not enough to definitively prove what existed in those ice-free regions beyond the barriers. What she really needed was the high-resolution photographs, the detailed images her father had taken with his professional camera equipment, the ones that showed the distant coastlines and the geometric formations and the atmospheric phenomena in clear detail. Those photos had been on his vessel when the authorities confiscated it. She assumed they were gone, destroyed or locked away in some classified archive where they would never see daylight again. She was wrong. In January of 2023, 2 months before Claudio died, he told Sophia something he had kept secret for nearly 7 years. The authorities had taken his camera equipment, but they had not taken all of his photographs, because Claudio, paranoid and careful in ways that proved justified, had created his own backup system during the voyage. Every night during his expedition, when he reviewed the day's photographs on his camera, he selected the most important images and copied them to a micro SD card. Not all the photos, just the ones that showed something significant: the distant landmasses, the temperature anomalies, the unusual atmospheric conditions, the geometric formations on the coastline. He kept that micro SD card separate from his main equipment, stored in a waterproof case that he kept on his person at all times, even when sleeping. When the maritime authorities confiscated his vessel and equipment, they took his cameras, his laptops, his storage drives, all his navigation gear. But Claudio was wearing his clothes. They searched him, but they were looking for weapons or communication devices, not tiny memory cards. The micro SD card, smaller than a fingernail, remained in his pocket throughout the entire confiscation process. He had kept that card hidden for 7 years. He had not told Sophia about it because he believed, probably correctly, that if she knew it existed, she would be at risk. The men who visited that night in October 2016 had made clear they were monitoring his family. If Sophia had known about the high-resolution photographs, she might have tried to analyze them, share them, do something with them, and that would have put her in danger. But now, with terminal illness making it clear his time was limited, Claudio decided the risk of the evidence being lost forever was greater than the risk of telling Sophia where it was. He gave her the micro SD card in a hospital room in Buenos Aires, 2 weeks before he died. He made her promise not to look at the images until after he was gone. He did not want her burdened with that knowledge while he was still alive, still potentially vulnerable to pressure or threats. Sophia kept that promise. She took the card, stored it carefully, and did not examine its contents until 3 days after her father's funeral in March 2023. When she finally opened the files on a secure laptop with no internet connection, she found 47 photographs, high-resolution images, professional quality, detailed enough to see textures and structures and features that the low-resolution satellite-transmitted photos had only hinted at. She spent hours examining each image. The photos of open ocean were unremarkable, except for their location: clear blue water, some whitecaps from wind, overcast skies. But the EXIF data placed these images at coordinates that should have been solid ice. They were proof of concept, evidence that liquid ocean existed where it should not. The photos of distant landmasses were more interesting. One showed what appeared to be a mountain range, dark peaks against grey sky, rising from a coastline that was clearly ice-free. The scale was hard to judge without reference points, but the mountains appeared substantial, not small hills but significant geological features. Another photo showed what might have been a cliff face or escarpment, a vertical wall of dark rock descending to the water's edge. But it was 4 specific photographs that made Sophia realize why the authorities had been so determined to confiscate her father's evidence. 4 images that showed formations on a distant coastline that were difficult to explain through natural geological processes. The formations appeared in 2 of the photos as distant shapes, barely visible on the horizon. In the other 2 photos, taken with maximum telephoto zoom, the shapes resolved into more detail. They were geometric. Not perfectly geometric, not obviously artificial, but regular enough that calling them natural required significant mental gymnastics. Rectangular structures, or possibly rock formations that happened to have rectangular profiles. Linear features that could have been walls or could have been natural cliff stratification. Perpendicular angles that might have been coincidental or might have been something else. Sophia had these 4 photographs analyzed by a geologist friend who owed her favors and could be trusted to keep quiet. The geologist's assessment was cautious but intriguing. The formations could potentially be natural. Basaltic lava flows can create columnar structures with geometric appearances. Sedimentary rock layers can fracture along straight lines, producing wall-like features. But the combination of features in these photographs, the way multiple geometric elements appeared in proximity to each other, was unusual. Not impossible naturally, but unusual enough that the geologist said if these formations existed in an accessible location, they would definitely warrant closer investigation. But they did not exist in an accessible location. They existed in a region that, according to official maps, should be buried under miles of ice, in waters that are restricted under international treaty, in an area that has been systematically kept off limits to civilian exploration for decades. Sophia also had the atmospheric phenomena photographs analyzed. These images showed the unusual light patterns her father had mentioned, the aurora-like displays occurring during daylight hours. She sent these to an atmospheric physicist she had met at a conference, again without explaining where the photos had been taken. The physicist's response was fascinating. The light patterns did not match typical auroral activity. The colors were wrong. The geometry was wrong. The time of occurrence was wrong. The physicist suggested they might be light pillars, an atmospheric optical phenomenon caused by ice crystals, but admitted the patterns did not quite fit that explanation either. Whatever was creating these light displays, it was not a commonly observed atmospheric effect. All of this evidence, the GPS data, the temperature logs, the low-resolution photos, and now the high-resolution images, Sophia compiled into a secure digital archive. She created multiple copies, stored in multiple locations, protected by multiple layers of security. She also created a detailed written account of her father's voyage, his confiscation experience, the night visitors, the systematic destruction of his career. Everything documented, everything backed up, everything ready to be released, if she decided the time was right. But she waited. For months after her father's death, she debated whether to go public. Part of her wanted to honor his memory by sharing his discoveries, by proving that what he saw was real. But another part remembered the threats, remembered what happened to him when he refused to stay silent, remembered that these organizations, whoever they were, had resources and reach that extended far beyond simple bureaucratic harassment. The decision of when to speak, when to share the evidence, when to risk whatever consequences might come, that decision weighed on Sophia every single day. Until finally, in late 2024, something happened that made the decision for her. Something that proved her father's experience was not isolated, that the pattern of suppression was ongoing, and that staying silent was no longer an option she could live with. In November of 2024, Sophia Nocelli received an email that changed everything. The sender was someone she had never heard of, a Norwegian sailor named Henrik Strand. The subject line read simply, "Your father was not alone." The message itself was brief. Strand said he had heard about Claudio Nocelli through maritime circles, that he knew what had happened after Claudio's return from Antarctica, and that he had his own story to share if Sophia was interested in listening. They spoke via encrypted video call 3 days later. Henrik Strand was in his late 50s, weathered face and cautious eyes, speaking English with a thick Scandinavian accent. He told Sophia he had been following the story of Jarle Andhøy, another Norwegian explorer whose Antarctic expedition in 2010 had ended in controversy and tragedy. Strand had been friends with one of Andhøy's crew members, a man named Samuel Massey, who had died when their vessel mysteriously sank in Antarctic waters. But according to Strand, The official story of what happened to that expedition was incomplete. Massey had sent emails to Strand during the voyage, messages that described discoveries similar to what Claudio Nocelli had reported: warmer waters in regions that should have been frozen, areas of open ocean beyond the ice barriers, and most intriguingly, what Massey described as thermal signatures, detected by their ship's instruments, heat sources coming from beneath the ice, in locations where no geothermal activity was supposed to exist. When the ship sank and Massey died, the investigation concluded it was due to severe weather and equipment failure, but Strand never believed that explanation. Massey was an experienced sailor. The vessel was well equipped, and the timing, coming just days after Massey's emails about the thermal anomalies, seemed too convenient. Strand had tried to raise questions about the investigation but was told firmly to let it go, that pushing for answers would not bring his friend back and might create problems for the survivors who needed to move on with their lives. Jarle Andhoy himself had been prosecuted after returning to Norway, charged with violating maritime safety regulations and Antarctic treaty provisions. He was fined, his vessel was confiscated, and he was essentially barred from future Antarctic expeditions. But the legal case focused entirely on permit violations and safety concerns. It never addressed what Andhoy and his crew had actually found during their voyage. That information disappeared into sealed court documents and classified incident reports. Sophia asked Strand why he was reaching out now, 14 years after the incident. His answer was direct: because he had recently learned about 2 other cases, both more recent, both following the same pattern, and he was tired of watching explorers disappear or get destroyed, while the truth about what they found remained buried. The first case Strand mentioned involved a Brazilian research team in 24. This was not a rogue civilian expedition like Claudio's or Andhoy's. This was an official naval research mission, properly permitted and sanctioned by the Brazilian government. The team was conducting oceanographic surveys in Antarctic waters as part of Brazil's commitment to the Antarctic Treaty scientific research protocols. In March of 24, the research vessel reported discovering unexpected thermal readings at approximately 88 degrees south latitude. The instruments detected heat signatures that did not match known geothermal activity patterns. The team requested permission to extend their mission to investigate further. That permission was initially granted by Brazilian Naval Command. Then something changed. Within 48 hours, the mission was abruptly recalled. The vessel was ordered to return to port immediately. The official explanation was equipment malfunction, concerns that the thermal readings were instrumentation errors caused by extreme cold affecting the sensors. But according to leaked documents that surfaced years later, documents that Strand had obtained from a source he refused to identify, the thermal readings had been verified by multiple independent instruments. The data was consistent, repeatable, and could not be explained by equipment failure. What happened to that data? It was classified. Not just restricted or confidential, but classified at a level that required national security clearance to access. For oceanographic temperature readings, the 3 officers who had been most vocal about investigating the thermal anomalies were quietly transferred to different postings. The expedition commander, a career naval officer with 20 years of service, took early retirement less than a year later, and the research vessel itself was decommissioned and sold for scrap within 2 years, which was unusual for a ship that was less than a decade old and had been recently refitted with new equipment. The second recent case was even more disturbing because it involved deliberate suppression of civilian research. In 2015, a team of independent scientists had pooled resources to fund a small expedition to study climate change effects on Antarctic ice shelves. The team included climatologists, glaciologists, and oceanographers from 3 different countries. They had proper permits, legitimate scientific credentials, and funding from private environmental research foundations. Their mission was straightforward: deploy temperature sensors and ice thickness monitors at various points around the Antarctic coast to gather data on melting rates and ocean warming. Standard climate research, nothing controversial, except that when they began deploying their instruments, they discovered something unexpected. In 2 locations, their ice-penetrating radar detected cavities beneath the ice shelf, not small caves or crevasses, but substantial voids, spaces large enough to contain liquid water and showing thermal activity. This was interesting but not entirely surprising. Subglacial lakes have been discovered beneath Antarctic ice before. What was surprising was the temperature readings. These voids were significantly warmer than other known subglacial lakes, showing temperatures that suggested active heating from unknown sources. The team reported their preliminary findings to the Antarctic Research Coordination Office, as required by their permit conditions. They requested authorization to deploy additional sensors to better characterize the thermal anomalies. That authorization was denied. They were told the locations they wanted to study were in environmentally sensitive zones that could not accommodate additional research activity. When the team pushed back, arguing that their work was minimally invasive and scientifically important, their permits were revoked entirely. The expedition was terminated. The team was required to remove all their equipment and leave Antarctic waters within 72 hours. When they returned home, they attempted to publish their preliminary findings in peer-reviewed journals. Every submission was rejected, not on scientific grounds, but on technicalities, insufficient data, incomplete methodology, need for peer review that somehow never materialized. One of the climatologists on the team tried to present their findings at an international climate conference. His presentation was removed from the schedule at the last minute due to what organizers called scheduling conflicts. Within a year, 2 members of the research team had left academic science entirely. The lead climatologist found his grant applications systematically rejected by organizations that had previously funded his work. The pattern was identical to what happened to Claudio Nocelli, just in a different professional context. Quiet suppression, systematic isolation, professional destruction without formal accusation. Strand had documentation for all of these cases. Not complete files, but enough evidence to show the pattern was real. Leaked emails, declassified portions of incident reports, testimony from crew members who were willing to speak off the record, financial records showing how research funding disappeared, legal documents from prosecutions that focused on procedural violations while avoiding any discussion of what the explorers had actually found. He sent Sophia copies of everything he had, and as she reviewed the materials, she realized something profound. Her father's experience was not unique. It was part of a systematic, decades-long effort to control information about Antarctic anomalies. The suppression crossed national boundaries, involved both civilian and military organizations, and operated with a level of coordination that suggested some form of international agreement or protocol. Every explorer who ventured into unauthorized areas and found evidence of warm water zones, thermal anomalies, ice-free regions, or unexplained phenomena faced similar consequences: confiscation of evidence, professional destruction, legal harassment, and in some cases, like Samuel Massey, death under circumstances that were never fully investigated. The pattern was undeniable, and it gave Sophia clarity about what she needed to do. Her father's evidence was important, but in isolation it could be dismissed as the claims of one man. Combined with these other cases, with this documented history of systematic suppression spanning decades, the evidence became something much harder to ignore. It became proof not just of Antarctic anomalies, but of an organized effort to keep those anomalies hidden from public knowledge. Sophia made her decision. She would go public with everything: her father's photographs, the GPS data, the temperature logs, and most importantly, the pattern of suppression that affected multiple explorers across multiple decades. She would compile it all into a comprehensive disclosure that could not be easily dismissed or buried. But before she could do that, she needed to understand why. Why was this information being suppressed? What was so important about these Antarctic anomalies that governments and international organizations were willing to destroy careers, confiscate evidence, and possibly even kill to keep them secret? The answer to that question lay in understanding the legal and political framework that has controlled Antarctica for over 60 years. The Antarctic Treaty was signed on December 1st, 1959, in Washington, D.C. 12 nations put their names on a document that would fundamentally change how one entire continent was governed: the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, Japan, Belgium, Norway, Chile, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Nations that agreed on almost nothing else during the height of the Cold War somehow found common ground when it came to Antarctica. The official purpose was noble: preserve Antarctica for peaceful purposes, prohibit military activity, promote scientific cooperation, protect the environment. These are worthy goals, and on the surface, the treaty appears to be exactly what it claims to be: an agreement to keep one of Earth's last pristine wildernesses free from exploitation and conflict. But look closer at the timing. 1959, just 12 years after Admiral Byrd's Operation HIGHJUMP expedition, the largest Antarctic mission in history, which ended abruptly under circumstances that were never fully explained. 8 years after multiple nations began establishing permanent research stations on the continent, stations that were officially scientific but often staffed by military personnel. 3 years after the International Geophysical Year, when coordinated research across Antarctica produced findings that remain partially classified to this day. The treaty was negotiated in remarkable secrecy. The discussions happened behind closed doors. The participating nations agreed on terms with unusual speed for international diplomacy, and the document they produced contained provisions that go far beyond simple environmental protection. Article 1 declares, Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. Military bases are prohibited. Military maneuvers are prohibited. Weapons testing is prohibited. This sounds straightforward until you realize that 7 of the signatory nations maintain permanent bases on Antarctica staffed by military personnel. They call them research stations, and technically the military members are there in scientific support roles. But the distinction is paper-thin. These are military operations in everything but name. Article 6 defines the treaty area as everything south of 60 degrees south latitude. Every island, every ice shelf, every piece of ocean. It is the most comprehensive territorial claim imaginable, except that Article 4 simultaneously says the treaty does not recognize any territorial claims. This creates a legal paradox where nations can maintain bases and claim jurisdiction while officially acknowledging no sovereignty. It is governance without ownership, control without legal responsibility. But the most significant provision is Article 9. This article establishes the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings, regular gatherings where signatory nations discuss implementation of the treaty and make recommendations for measures to further its objectives. These meetings operate by consensus. Every consultative party must agree before any measure is adopted. This gives each major nation effective veto power over Antarctic activities. The meetings are not public. Observers can attend, but deliberations happen in closed sessions. Recommendations are published, but the discussions that led to those recommendations remain confidential. And critically, these consultative meetings have the authority to designate certain areas as specially protected or specially managed, creating zones where even permitted scientific research requires additional layers of authorization. Over 50 additional nations have acceded to the treaty since 1959, but only 29 have consultative status, meaning voting power. To gain consultative status, a nation must demonstrate substantial scientific research activity in Antarctica. This creates a self-reinforcing system where the nations that already control Antarctic research decide which other nations get to participate in governance decisions. The treaty was initially set to last 30 years, with provision for review after that period. In 1991, the Madrid Protocol on Environmental Protection was added, extending the treaty indefinitely and banning all mineral resource activities until 2048. This is presented as environmental protection, and perhaps it is. But it also conveniently prevents any nation or private entity from exploiting the estimated $1 trillion worth of mineral resources that geological surveys have confirmed exist beneath Antarctic ice. 2048. That is the year when mining restrictions expire, 24 years from now. What happens then will depend on who controls the treaty system and who has the most accurate information about what resources actually exist in Antarctica and where. Nations that have been conducting classified research for decades will have enormous advantages over nations operating with publicly available information. But mineral resources may not be the most important thing the treaty system protects. Consider what has been discovered in Antarctica, despite the restrictions. Lake Vostok, buried under 2.5 miles of ice, containing liquid water and possibly microbial life that has been isolated for millions of years. Magnetic anomalies that suggest substantial metallic deposits or unknown geological structures beneath the ice. Thermal vents and geothermal activity in regions where such features were not predicted by geological models. Every one of these discoveries was made by official research teams operating under treaty protocols, and every one was initially subject to information control, with findings released to the public only after careful review, and often with significant details omitted or classified. What this means is that the treaty system does not just regulate who can explore Antarctica, it regulates what information about Antarctica reaches public knowledge. The enforcement mechanism is elegant. Any nation that violates treaty provisions faces international diplomatic pressure and potential sanctions. But more effectively, any researcher who operates outside approved channels finds their work dismissed by the scientific community, their funding eliminated, their credentials questioned, The system does not need heavy-handed suppression because it has built institutional control directly into the structure of Antarctic research. Claudio Nocelli understood something crucial when she examined the treaty documents. Her father was not punished for sailing to Antarctica. He was punished for doing so outside the treaty system, without authorization, without oversight, without the ability for consultative nations to control what he found and what information he shared. The treaty creates a legal framework where independent discovery is effectively impossible. Every expedition, every research project, every observation must flow through channels that can be monitored and managed. This is why 47 nations agreed to prohibit Antarctic mineral exploitation until 2048, not because they are uninterested in trillion-dollar resources, but because they need time to fully map and understand what is there before allowing exploitation. The treaty buys time for classified research while keeping civilian explorers and independent scientists away from areas where they might discover things that consultative nations are not ready to make public. The question Sophia kept coming back to was simple. What did Operation HIGHJUMP find in 1947 that led to this entire treaty system being created 12 years later? What was important enough that Cold War enemies agreed to cooperate? And what is still being hidden 77 years after Byrd's expedition? Operation HIGHJUMP remains the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted. The scale alone tells you this was not a routine scientific mission. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, 4,700 men, equipment and supplies for a 6-month deployment. This was a military operation of the type you launch when you are preparing for war or expecting to find something that requires overwhelming force to secure. The official designation was United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program. The stated purpose was to establish American research facilities in Antarctica, test equipment in extreme cold conditions, and train personnel for polar operations. Standard military logistics and research objectives. Nothing that would require nearly 5,000 people and resources that could have supplied a small invasion force. Admiral Richard Byrd was chosen to lead the expedition. This was not his first time in Antarctica. Byrd was already famous for his polar explorations in the 1920s and 30s. He had flown over the South Pole in 1929. He had led multiple expeditions and was considered the foremost American expert on Antarctic conditions. If anyone could be trusted with a major Antarctic mission, it was Byrd. The task force departed Norfolk, Virginia, in December of 1946. They sailed south with enough fuel, food, and equipment to last through the Antarctic summer, which runs from November to February in the southern hemisphere. The plan was to establish Little America 4, a base on the Ross Ice Shelf, and conduct extensive mapping and research operations radiating out from that central location. Everything proceeded normally for the first few weeks. The base was established. Aircraft began flying reconnaissance missions. Surface teams deployed to study ice conditions and geography. Reports sent back to Washington described successful operations and valuable data collection. This was exactly the kind of mission everyone expected. Then, in late February of 1947, something changed. The expedition, planned for 6 months and supplied accordingly, was abruptly terminated after only 8 weeks. The task force received orders to pack up, abandon the base they had just established, and return to the United States immediately. The official explanation was early onset of winter conditions, making continued operations too dangerous. But this explanation makes no sense. February is midsummer in Antarctica. Weather conditions in February are typically the best of the entire year. This is when research teams do their most extensive work because temperatures are warmest and daylight is longest. The idea that experienced polar explorers led by Admiral Byrd would be surprised by winter conditions arriving 2 months early and would abandon a multi-million-dollar operation because of weather is simply not credible. Something happened during those 8 weeks. Something significant enough that the Navy decided to terminate the largest polar expedition in history and bring everyone home immediately. Admiral Byrd returned to the United States in April of 1947. On March 5th, while the task force was still sailing north, Byrd gave an interview to a reporter from El Mercurio, a Chilean newspaper. The interview was brief, conducted at a port in Chile where the task force had stopped for supplies. What Byrd said in that interview has been debated and analyzed for decades. According to the El Mercurio article, Byrd spoke about the strategic importance of Antarctica and warned that the United States needed to take defensive measures against potential threats from polar regions. The article quoted him saying that in the event of a new war, America could be attacked by craft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He mentioned the expedition had discovered evidence of resources in Antarctica that could sustain modern civilization for centuries. But the most controversial part, the part that has fueled speculation ever since, was a brief mention of land beyond the pole. Byrd allegedly spoke about discovering territory past the South Pole, regions that extended beyond what maps showed. The exact wording has been disputed because the original article was in Spanish, and translations vary, but the core claim remains consistent across versions. Byrd said they found something beyond the known Antarctic geography. When Byrd arrived back in Washington, he was immediately debriefed, not by his Navy superiors in a routine mission review, but by a board of inquiry that included representatives from multiple government agencies. The debriefing lasted several days and was classified. Byrd was ordered not to discuss details of the expedition publicly. He gave no more interviews. He wrote no detailed accounts of Operation HIGHJUMP. For a man who had previously written extensively about his polar adventures and who was not shy about self-promotion, this sudden silence was remarkable. For decades, the official records of Operation HIGHJUMP remained classified. Bits and pieces were released over the years, sanitized reports that described routine research activities and equipment testing. Nothing controversial. Nothing that would explain why the mission was terminated early or why Byrd was silenced. The full operational records were not supposed to be declassified until the 21st century. But in 2015, something unexpected happened. Portions of Admiral Byrd's personal diary from the Operation HIGHJUMP expedition were leaked online. How they were obtained remains unclear. Whether they are authentic has been debated. The National Archives has neither confirmed nor denied their legitimacy. But the contents of these diary entries, if genuine, explain everything about why the expedition ended early and why the Antarctic Treaty System was created 12 years later. The diary entries describe Byrd taking a reconnaissance flight on February 19, 1947. He flew south from Little America Base, following a heading that should have taken him over the interior ice sheet toward the South Pole. But according to the diary, his aircraft encountered unusual conditions. The ice below gave way to ice-free terrain, valleys with vegetation, rivers flowing through landscapes that should have been buried under miles of ice. The diary describes Byrd's instruments malfunctioning, his magnetic compass spinning uselessly, his radio communications disrupted, but his altimeter and airspeed indicator continued working, showing he was flying at 10,000 feet over terrain that climbed from sea level to substantial elevation. He described seeing what appeared to be forests, or at least vegetation dense enough to create dark green patches across the landscape. According to the diary, Byrd flew for several hours over this terrain, documenting everything visually, but unable to transmit reports due to radio interference. He described the temperature outside the aircraft rising to levels inconsistent with Antarctic conditions, his thermometer reading 38 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude, which would suggest surface temperatures well above freezing. The diary then describes an encounter that pushes credibility to its limits. Byrd claimed his aircraft was intercepted by unknown craft, disc-shaped vehicles that matched his speed and altitude effortlessly, demonstrating flight capabilities far beyond any known technology. These craft escorted his plane to a landing area where Byrd was allegedly taken underground and met with beings who delivered warnings about humanity's use of atomic weapons and the dangers of future conflict. This is where the diary entries become difficult to accept. The story shifts from unusual but potentially explainable natural phenomena to claims of advanced non-human intelligence operating in Antarctica. If you are skeptical, this is where you dismiss the entire account as fantasy or fabrication, and maybe that is the correct response. Maybe these diary entries are fake, created by someone wanting to inject alien mythology into Antarctic exploration history. But here is what makes them hard to completely dismiss. The descriptions of ice-free terrain, warmer temperatures, and vegetation match exactly what Claudio Nocelli documented 70 years later using GPS coordinates and temperature logs. The atmospheric anomalies Byrd described match the unusual light phenomena Nocelli photographed. The geographic location, beyond the known ice shelf boundaries in regions that should be frozen solid, is consistent between both accounts. Strip away the alleged encounter with non-human intelligence. Focus only on the geographic and environmental observations. What remains is a description of Antarctic conditions that contradicts official scientific understanding but aligns with multiple independent reports from explorers separated by decades who had no connection to each other. The diary entries end with Byrd returning to base and immediately reporting to his superiors. He describes being ordered to maintain absolute secrecy, being told that what he discovered had implications for national security, being instructed that public knowledge of these findings would cause panic and social disruption. The final entry is dated March 11th, 1947, and states simply that he has been ordered to remain silent and will comply with those orders. Whether these diary entries are authentic is almost beside the point. What matters is that something happened during Operation HIGHJUMP, significant enough to terminate the mission early, significant enough to classify records for 70 years, and significant enough to trigger the creation of an international treaty system that has controlled Antarctic exploration ever since. Claudio Nocelli obtained copies of these diary entries through Henrik Strand's network of researchers. She read them alongside her father's documentation and saw the parallels immediately. The temperature anomalies matched. The descriptions of ice-free zones matched. The coordinates, when you converted Bird's navigation methods to modern GPS, placed his alleged flight path over the same regions where Claudio had found open ocean and distant landmasses. Two explorers, 70 years apart, using completely different technology and approaching from different directions, documented the same anomalies in the same general region of Antarctica. That pattern was too specific to be coincidence. Either both accounts were fabricated, which seemed unlikely given that Claudio had physical evidence and Bird had no reason to lie in a personal diary, or both men had genuinely encountered geographic and environmental conditions in Antarctica that do not match official scientific models. And if that was true, then the question became unavoidable. What else is hidden in Antarctica? What other discoveries have been made and classified? And what is important enough about these findings that the world's governments decided 77 years ago that public knowledge was too dangerous to permit? In the age of satellite imaging, when you can zoom in on almost any location on Earth with enough detail to count cars in a parking lot, Antarctica remains curiously difficult to see. Pull up Google Earth right now and navigate to the Antarctic continent. Try to zoom in on the interior regions. Try to examine the coastlines in detail. What you will notice immediately is that large portions of the continent are blurred, pixelated, or simply missing high-resolution imagery. The official explanation is technical limitations. Antarctica's extreme conditions, the limited satellite passes over polar regions, the challenges of imaging through cloud cover, and atmospheric interference. These are legitimate obstacles. Polar orbiting satellites do have more limited coverage than equatorial regions. Weather does interfere with optical imaging, but these technical challenges do not fully explain the patterns of what imagery is available and what is mysteriously absent. Claudio Nocelli spent months analyzing publicly available satellite data of Antarctica, not casually browsing Google Earth, but systematically examining every available imaging platform. Google Earth, Bing Maps, NASA's Worldview System, ESA's Copernicus database, commercial satellite providers. She compiled the coordinates where her father had documented anomalies and compared them against satellite coverage. What she found was striking. Every single location where Claudio had recorded unusual conditions, the blurred or low-resolution imagery, the regions at 83 to 85 degrees south, where his GPS data showed him sailing through open ocean, completely obscured in satellite images, the distant coastlines he had photographed with geometric formations, either missing from satellite databases or rendered at such low resolution that no detail was visible. But the pattern went beyond just Claudio's coordinates. Sophia cross-referenced with the locations mentioned in Operation HIGHJUMP records and the areas where other explorers had reported anomalies. In almost every case, satellite imagery for those specific regions was degraded, outdated, or simply unavailable. Meanwhile, other parts of Antarctica, including scientific research stations and known geographic features, had clear high-resolution coverage. This was not random. This was selective. Sophia reached out to a contact she had made during her marine biology research, a remote sensing specialist who worked with satellite data for oceanographic studies. She asked him, hypothetically, whether it would be technically possible to deliberately degrade satellite imagery for specific geographic regions while maintaining full resolution elsewhere. His answer was immediate and unequivocal. Yes, absolutely. In fact, it happens all the time for sensitive military installations and government facilities. The technology to blur, pixelate, or simply withhold certain imagery is standard practice in satellite mapping systems. He explained that organizations like Google and Microsoft do not actually operate their own imaging satellites for most of their mapping products. They license imagery from government and commercial satellite operators. Those operators can impose restrictions on what gets published. Certain coordinates can be flagged as restricted, and the mapping companies either blur the imagery or use old low-resolution data instead. The end user sees what appears to be technical limitations, but it is actually deliberate information control. Sophia asked if there was any way to access unrestricted satellite data for Antarctica. Her contact said theoretically, yes, if you could get authorization to access raw satellite feeds from organizations like NASA or the National Reconnaissance Office. But that authorization requires security clearances and legitimate research justifications. Civilian researchers studying Antarctic geography would need to demonstrate their work served approved scientific purposes under Antarctic treaty protocols. Independent investigators asking questions about anomalous regions would be denied access. This created a perfect information control system. The satellites captured full-resolution imagery of everything in Antarctica. Government and military organizations had access to that complete data, but the public only saw sanitized versions with sensitive areas degraded or removed. Anyone who questioned why certain regions were blurred could be told it was technical limitations or weather interference, and most people would accept that explanation without further investigation. But satellite imagery was only one layer of the censorship. Sophia discovered something even more interesting when she started looking at thermal imaging data. Satellites do not just capture visible light photographs. They also record infrared radiation, which allows detection of heat signatures. This is useful for monitoring volcanic activity, tracking ocean currents, studying ice melt patterns. It should also reveal any unusual thermal activity in Antarctica. NASA's MODIS system, Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer, has been collecting thermal data from Antarctica for over 20 years. The data is publicly available through NASA's Earth Data Portal. Sophia downloaded thermal imaging files for the regions where her father had recorded elevated temperatures. She expected to find either normal readings that would contradict his data or elevated temperatures that would confirm his findings. What she actually found was data gaps. Entire sections of the thermal imaging dataset were simply missing for the coordinates she was investigating. The files existed, but they contained no data values for those specific locations, just null values, empty cells where temperature readings should have been. Sophia contacted NASA's data support team to ask about the gaps. She was told it was likely due to cloud cover preventing clear thermal readings, or possibly instrument calibration issues during certain time periods. But when she examined thermal data for other Antarctic regions from the same time periods, those areas had complete data. The gaps were specific to the coordinates she was investigating. She tried accessing thermal data from other satellite systems, European Space Agency satellites, Japanese weather satellites, commercial infrared imaging providers. The pattern repeated. Either the data for those specific coordinates was degraded, incomplete, or simply unavailable, but surrounding areas had full coverage. In 2019, a minor scandal emerged in remote sensing circles when an NSA contractor leaked internal communications about satellite imaging protocols. The leak was quickly contained, and the contractor was prosecuted, but not before several documents circulated through online forums. One of those documents, which Sophia obtained through Henrik Strand's network, was a memo discussing sanitization protocols for sensitive geographic regions. The memo was heavily redacted, but the visible portions described procedures for processing satellite imagery before public release. It mentioned coordinate-based filtering systems that automatically flagged certain regions for review. It referenced interagency agreements about what imagery could be published without security review. And, critically, it included Antarctica in a list of locations subject to enhanced screening, alongside known military installations and nuclear facilities. The memo did not explain why Antarctica required enhanced screening. It did not specify which coordinates were flagged or what was being protected, but it confirmed that satellite imagery of Antarctica was being deliberately managed, not just for environmental protection or scientific cooperation, but for security reasons. This was the smoking gun Sophia had been looking for. Proof that the information control was not bureaucratic caution or technical limitation. It was systematic censorship operated by intelligence agencies with security mandates. The same organizations that had confiscated her father's evidence, that had silenced Admiral Byrd, that had suppressed findings from multiple expeditions over decades, were now controlling what the public could see of Antarctica through satellite systems. The technology had changed from confiscating photographs to filtering digital imagery, but the goal remained the same: control information. Limit independent verification. ensure that what people knew about Antarctica came only from approved sources operating within the treaty system. And if they were going to such lengths to control satellite imagery, Sophia realized, then what her father had found, what Byrd had documented, what dozens of explorers had glimpsed over the decades, must be visible from space. The anomalies were real, significant, and consistent enough that unrestricted satellite coverage would allow anyone with internet access to see evidence of ice-free regions, thermal anomalies, and possibly even the geometric structures that multiple explorers had reported. The censorship itself was proof. You do not blur satellite imagery of empty ice. You blur it because there is something there that you do not want people to see. February 3rd, 2023. Claudio Nocelli sat in a hospital room in Buenos Aires, his body failing but his mind still sharp. The cancer had spread too far for treatment to make any difference. The doctors gave him weeks, maybe a month if he was fortunate. Sophia had taken leave from her work to be with him during these final days. And it was in these quiet hours, when her mother had gone home to rest, and the hospital corridors were silent, that her father finally spoke about things he had kept buried for 7 years. "I need to tell you what I really saw," he said. His voice was weak but clear. "Not the sanitized version I told the authorities. Not the careful story I gave your mother to protect her from worry. The truth." Sophia pulled her chair closer to the bed. She had her phone ready to record, but Claudio shook his head. "No recording," he said. "You will remember this. You have to remember it exactly as I tell you, because once I am gone, they cannot threaten me anymore. And then you can decide what to do with it." He began with the passage through the ice wall. He had found it on February 13th, 2016, exactly where older maps suggested it might exist, a channel barely wide enough for his vessel, cutting through ice formations that rose 60 feet above the waterline. The passage twisted and turned for nearly 8 miles before opening into waters that should not have existed. "The first thing I noticed was the temperature," Claudio said. "Not just warmer, but wrong for that latitude. The air felt like autumn in Patagonia, not Antarctic summer, and the water, when I tested it, was nearly 40 degrees. That is temperate ocean temperature. That is water you could swim in if you were tough enough." He sailed south for 3 days, keeping meticulous logs, photographing everything, unable to believe what his instruments were telling him. Open ocean stretched to the horizon. No ice shelves, no frozen barriers, just water, dark and deep, under skies that showed light patterns he could not explain. On the 4th day, he saw the shoreline, distant at first, just a dark line on the horizon. He sailed closer, using his telephoto lenses to examine the coast. "There were formations," he said. "I know what natural rock looks like. I have sailed past enough coastlines to recognize geology. These were not random cliffs. They had angles, straight lines, perpendicular intersections. Maybe they were natural. Maybe erosion or tectonic activity created those shapes. But they looked constructed." He tried to sail closer, but was prevented, not by ice or weather, but by vessels. 3 ships appeared from different directions, converging on his position. Military ships, he was certain, though they flew no flags and showed no identifying marks. They maintained distance but made their presence obvious. A warning. A boundary he was not supposed to cross. "That was when I knew this was bigger than I had imagined," Claudio said. "This was not about environmental protection or treaty violations. Those ships were there to guard something, to prevent people like me from getting too close to whatever is beyond that shoreline." He had turned back at that point. He had the evidence he needed. He had the photographs, the coordinates, the temperature readings. He did not need to provoke a direct confrontation with military forces. He sailed north, back through the ice wall passage, and headed for Ushuaia. Along the way, he noticed the ships following at a distance, tracking him all the way back to Argentine waters. "They knew who I was before I even docked," Claudio said. "They had been watching the entire time. The confiscation was not a response to my return. It was planned. They were waiting for me." He looked at Sophia with eyes that held both regret and determination. "I stayed silent because they threatened you, because I could not risk them harming you to punish me. But I was wrong to think silence would keep you safe. Silence just lets them continue hiding the truth. Someone has to speak. Someone has to show people that there are places in this world that we are not allowed to know about, discoveries that are kept from us for reasons we are never told." He gripped her hand with what little strength he had left. "They are not hiding empty ice, Sophia. They are hiding what is beyond it. And whatever it is important enough that they have built an entire international system to control who can explore it and what information reaches the public. That should terrify everyone, not because of what might be there, but because of what it means that our governments have decided we cannot be trusted with the truth. Claudio Nocelli died 3 weeks later, on February 24, 2023. His death certificate listed cancer as the cause. There were no suspicious circumstances, no indication of anything other than natural illness. But Sophia could not help wondering if the stress of those 7 years, the destruction of his career, the constant pressure and harassment had contributed to his decline. Whether his body had simply given up under the weight of carrying secrets that were too heavy to bear alone. At his funeral, she made a promise. She promised that his silence would end with his death, that the evidence he had preserved, the truth he had discovered, would not remain buried, that his story would be told, along with the stories of all the other explorers who had been silenced, suppressed, and destroyed for daring to look beyond the boundaries of approved knowledge. It took her nearly 2 years to prepare. 2 years of gathering evidence, verifying information, building networks with other researchers and investigators. 2 years of making sure that when she finally went public, the story would be complete enough and documented enough that it could not be easily dismissed or suppressed. Now, she was ready to honor that promise. The question everyone asks when they hear about Antarctic suppression is simple. What could possibly be important enough to justify this level of secrecy? What exists beyond those ice walls that requires decades of coordinated information control, systematic destruction of independent explorers, and censorship of satellite imagery? Sophia Nocelli has spent years considering possible answers. She has reviewed the evidence from her father's expedition, from Operation HIGHJUMP, from the other silenced explorers. She has analyzed the patterns of what gets suppressed and what gets published. She has studied the history of Antarctic exploration and the timing of when certain discoveries led to increased restrictions. And she has come to understand that there is likely not one single answer, but multiple overlapping reasons why Antarctica's secrets are so carefully guarded. The first and most conventional explanation involves natural resources. Geological surveys conducted under treaty protocols have confirmed that Antarctica contains massive deposits of coal, iron ore, copper, gold, platinum, and rare earth minerals. Oil and natural gas reserves beneath the continental shelf are estimated to rival those of the Middle East. These are resources worth trillions of dollars, resources that could shift global economic and political power if nations gained unrestricted access to them. The Antarctic Treaty currently prohibits mining until 2048. This moratorium was presented as environmental protection, a way to preserve the continent's pristine ecosystem. But look at it from a strategic perspective. The nations that have conducted the most extensive geological surveys, the ones with the best maps of where resources are located, will have enormous advantages when the moratorium expires. They will know exactly where to stake claims, where to focus extraction operations, where the highest value deposits exist. Keeping independent explorers away from Antarctica ensures that this knowledge remains concentrated among treaty nations. If civilian geologists or private mining companies could freely explore the continent, they might discover resource locations that governments want to keep classified until they are ready to exploit them. The suppression is not about hiding that resources exist. Everyone knows Antarctica has minerals and fuel reserves. It is about controlling who knows where those resources are located and preventing anyone from gaining advantages outside the official system. But resource control, while plausible, does not fully explain the extreme measures taken against explorers like Claudio Nocelli. You do not send unmarked ships to intercept civilian vessels. You do not confiscate evidence and destroy careers. You do not censor satellite imagery just to protect knowledge about coal deposits. There has to be something more. The second explanation involves ancient history. Antarctica was not always frozen. Geological evidence shows that 15 million years ago, the continent had temperate forests and diverse ecosystems. Even more intriguingly, some geologists argue that as recently as 12,000 years ago, parts of Antarctica may have been ice-free, or at least had significantly less ice coverage than today. This creates a fascinating historical question. If portions of Antarctica were habitable in the relatively recent past, could there be evidence of human activity? Could there be ruins of settlements from civilizations that existed before recorded history? The Piri-Reis map and the Orontius Phineus map, both created in the 1500s, show Antarctic coastlines with remarkable accuracy. These maps predate modern Antarctic exploration by 3 centuries. Where did the cartographers get their information? The conventional explanation is that these maps copied data from ancient sources, possibly maps created by earlier seafaring cultures that have been lost to history. But if those ancient sources showed Antarctic coastlines, it means someone explored and mapped Antarctica when it was less frozen than it is today, which means evidence of that ancient exploration might still exist beneath the ice. If archaeological evidence was discovered showing advanced civilizations existed in Antarctica thousands of years ago, it would fundamentally challenge our understanding of human history. The implications for archaeology, anthropology, and historical timelines would be profound. And those implications might be destabilizing enough that governments would prefer to keep such discoveries classified until they can be properly contextualized and controlled. Sophia finds this explanation compelling because it aligns with the timing of increased suppression. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, just after the International Geophysical Year, when extensive research was conducted across the continent. What if that research uncovered archaeological evidence? What if the treaty system was created not just to regulate future exploration, but to control information about past discoveries? But there is a third explanation, one that is harder to discuss because it pushes into territory that sounds like science fiction. What if the suppression is not about what is under the ice, but about what currently exists in Antarctica's ice-free regions? What if Claudio Nocelli and Admiral Byrd and the other explorers found evidence of ongoing activity, not ancient ruins but active installations? Consider the facts. Multiple independent explorers have documented warm water zones where temperatures should be far below freezing. These thermal anomalies cannot all be explained by geothermal vents. The heat signatures detected by satellite systems and research instruments suggest active heating from sources that have not been publicly identified. Military vessels patrol regions that are supposedly empty wilderness. Satellite imagery of specific coordinates is deliberately degraded or censored. One possibility is secret military bases. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet forces explored the possibility of establishing classified installations in Antarctica's interior. The remoteness provides security. The treaty prohibition on military activity might be honored in technical terms, while being violated in practical reality through the use of research stations that serve dual purposes. If classified military facilities exist in Antarctica's ice-free zones, that would absolutely justify the level of suppression we have seen. But there is an even more unsettling possibility. What if the installations are not human? What if the geometric structures that Claudio photographed, the formations that Admiral Byrd described in his diary, are not ancient ruins but active facilities operated by non-human intelligence? This sounds absurd. This is where most people stop taking the story seriously. But consider that the United States government has recently acknowledged the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena that demonstrate flight capabilities beyond known human technology. The Pentagon has released videos. Congressional hearings have addressed the topic. The existence of something in our skies that we do not understand is no longer fringe speculation. It is admitted fact. If non-human intelligence exists and has the technology to traverse our atmosphere, where would they establish a presence on Earth? They would choose somewhere remote, somewhere with natural barriers that limit human access, somewhere protected by international agreements that keep civilian populations away. Antarctica fits those criteria perfectly. Sophia does not claim to know which of these explanations is correct. She does not have definitive proof of resource conspiracies or ancient civilizations or non-human bases. What she has is evidence that something in Antarctica is being deliberately hidden. She has documentation of systematic suppression spanning 70 years. She has her father's photographs and coordinates, proving that ice-free regions exist where official maps show only frozen wasteland. She has satellite censorship patterns that confirm information control is active and ongoing. The specific nature of what is being hidden is less important than the fact that it is being hidden. Because regardless of whether the secrets involve mineral wealth or archaeological discoveries, or classified installations or something even stranger, the fundamental issue remains the same. Governments and international organizations have decided that certain knowledge about our planet should be kept from public awareness. They have built legal frameworks to enforce that secrecy, and they have destroyed the lives of people who challenged those restrictions. That is the real story Sophia wants to tell. Not wild speculation about what might exist in Antarctica, but documented evidence that we are not allowed to know what exists there. That exploration is controlled, information is censored, and independent discovery is systematically suppressed. That should concern everyone regardless of what the hidden truth turns out to be, because it reveals that in the 21st century, with all our technology and proclaimed values of transparency, There are still places on our own planet that we are forbidden to understand. Sofia Nocelli made her decision in October of 2024. She would release everything. Her father's photographs, the GPS data, the temperature logs, the documentation of systematic suppression, the satellite censorship evidence, the testimonies from other silenced explorers, all of it compiled into a comprehensive disclosure that could not be ignored or easily dismissed. She did not do this recklessly. She understood the risks. She remembered the night visitors at her parents' home, the threats against her safety, the professional destruction her father had endured. But she also understood that silence had not protected him. Cooperation had not made his life easier. The organizations controlling Antarctic information did not reward compliance. They simply continued operating in secrecy, while those who knew the truth carried that burden alone until it destroyed them. Her father had died carrying secrets he was afraid to share. Sofia refused to make the same choice. She reached out to journalists, documentary filmmakers, independent researchers. She offered them access to the evidence with only one condition. They had to present it completely and accurately, without sensationalism, but also without downplaying the implications. She wanted the story told as it actually happened. An experienced navigator sailed beyond Antarctica's ice walls, documented conditions that contradicted official geography, and was systematically destroyed for bringing back evidence of what he found. The response was mixed. Some journalists were interested, but their editors killed the stories, citing lack of corroboration or concerns about promoting conspiracy theories. Some documentary producers wanted to focus on the alien angle, turning it into entertainment rather than serious investigation. Sofia declined those offers. She was not interested in creating more noise in an already crowded field of Antarctic speculation. She wanted to present evidence that could be verified, coordinates that could be checked, documentation that could be examined by independent experts. Eventually, she found collaborators who understood what she was trying to accomplish. Researchers who had been investigating Antarctic anomalies for years and were looking for exactly the kind of primary source evidence Sofia possessed. Together, they began building a comprehensive archive, not just her father's documentation, but the accumulated evidence from decades of suppressed exploration. Henrik Strand's files on other silenced expeditions, leaked documents about satellite censorship protocols, declassified portions of Operation HIGHJUMP records, analysis of thermal imaging data showing unexplained heat signatures. The archive went online in November of 2024, multiple mirror sites to prevent it from being taken down, distributed across servers in countries that have strong information freedom protections. The coordinates are there, the photographs are there, the GPS data is there. Everything someone would need to verify Claudio Nocelli's claims independently. And the archive is growing. Other researchers are contributing. Former military personnel who worked on Antarctic operations are coming forward with their own testimonies. Scientists who had their research suppressed are sharing their findings. The pattern Sofia's father experienced is not unique, it is systemic, and now it is documented in ways that are difficult to suppress or deny. Sofia knows this does not mean the truth will suddenly be revealed. Governments and treaty organizations have too much invested in maintaining the current system. They will dismiss the archive as conspiracy mongering. They will attack the credibility of the contributors. They will continue censoring satellite imagery and controlling access to Antarctic regions. The structures of suppression are too deeply embedded to collapse just because evidence is made public. But what the archive does accomplish is giving people the ability to investigate for themselves. The coordinates are available. Anyone with access to satellite data or the resources to mount an expedition can attempt to verify what Claudio found. The thermal anomalies can be checked against publicly available NASA data, once you know where to look and what data gaps to notice. The patterns of explorer suppression can be researched through court records and maritime documentation that is accessible if you know what to search for. Knowledge is no longer concentrated in the hands of treaty organizations and intelligence agencies. It is distributed, and distributed knowledge is much harder to control than centralized information. Sofia continues her marine biology work. She has not become a full-time Antarctic activist or conspiracy researcher. Her life goes on, but she also continues expanding the archive, connecting with other researchers, and documenting new cases of suppression when they emerge. This has become part of her father's legacy. Not the grand discoveries he made, but the evidence he preserved and the courage to eventually share it despite the risks. There is something you can do with this information. You can investigate the coordinates, pull up Google Earth, and navigate to 83 degrees south latitude in the regions where Claudio's GPS data placed him. Notice the blurred imagery. Ask yourself why. You can file Freedom of Information requests for Antarctic satellite data. See what gets released and what gets redacted. You can support researchers who are working to understand polar anomalies through legitimate scientific investigation. Or you can simply remember that when someone tells you a place is completely understood and fully explored, they might be wrong. There are still mysteries in our world. There are still discoveries waiting to be made. And sometimes, the biggest mystery is not what exists in remote places, but why we are not allowed to know. Claudio Nocelli's story is not about proving aliens or lost civilizations. It is about a man who sailed where he was told not to go, documented what he found, and paid the price for independent discovery in a world where certain knowledge is controlled. His legacy is the evidence he preserved and the question he leaves us with. What else are we not allowed to know? And are we willing to accept that there are places on our own planet where exploration is forbidden, information is censored, and truth is determined by organizations that operate in secrecy without public accountability? Those are questions worth asking. And if enough people start asking them, eventually, someone will have to provide answers. Tell me in the comments right now, do you believe what Claudio Nocelli found? Do you think there are hidden lands beyond Antarctica's ice walls? Do you believe governments are suppressing information about what really exists there? And most importantly, if you had the resources to mount your own expedition, would you have the courage to sail into forbidden waters and risk everything to discover the truth? This investigation continues. As long as Antarctica remains mysterious, as long as questions remain unanswered, we will keep exploring, questioning, and seeking the truth. Because the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is worth pursuing. The truth is out there, beyond the ice walls, beneath the frozen surface, hidden in classified documents and censored satellite imagery, and you deserve to know it. Subscribe, stay curious, and never stop asking questions. This is Mr. H, and I will see you in the next investigation.